Good afternoon. I'm James Hackney, Dean of the School of Law and co-chair of the Presidential Council on Diversity and Inclusion. We are gathered here today to engage in a conversation on anti-Asian racism. This is a subject that is regrettably long overdue for discussion and action. The violence, trauma, and insults that members of our Asian community have suffered, combined with the scourge of misogyny that all too frequently intersects with racism, are not new. The Chinese Massacre of 1871, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the forced internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, the brutal murder of Vincent Chin in 1982, violence against Asians and Asian-identified businesses in my hometown of South Central Los Angeles during the 1992 uprising, the targeting of Asian women in the Atlanta killing spree, and so many more events that horrify and appall us. These are all moments in history and markers for the present. Recent events have brought to the surface at least some of what is happening in the here and now in our community, and a sense of urgency that we must do better. I hope that the conversation today serves as a catalyst and helps provide a context for much needed action on our part so that we can shape a better future. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Bob Jose, Dean for Cultural and Spiritual Life. Bob?
Thank you, James, and good evening, everyone. We come together tonight to discuss a matter of great importance. Forums like this, the Civility Series, is meant to bring to light national and world issues that have an impact on each of us, an impact that is felt deeply and intimately. In light of the latest outbreak of senseless violence, this time aimed at the Asian community, our discussion tonight will focus on the context in all of this sits, as well as what we can and should be doing about it. This conversation that we're having here will begin tonight, but it cannot and must not end here. But it has to continue. It has to continue with the goal of developing and executing solutions. This absolutely has to happen if we're ever going to stem the tide of racism. But for tonight, as we hear our speakers, I would encourage you to listen closely, reflect deeply about what's being said and what's at hand. And then after that reflection, consider what each of us can do to address this terrible matter. Thank you very much, everyone. And I'd like to turn it over to Dean Uda Puerger, Dean of the College of CSSH.
Thank you so very much, Bob, and also James for Deans Hackney and Deans Jose for your powerful words. I just want to remind us that this event tonight is one small piece in a larger puzzle, and just want to remind us of the ambitions of events such as this, events that are part of a long-standing series that we have at Northeastern, co-organized by the academic side and by student affairs, a series that we often call for short the Civility Series, which has had a focus on a term that we have labeled civic sustainability. Among the goals of civic sustainability are to acknowledge past and present problems, to practice civility while engaging with difficult questions, to broaden personal networks, and also to find common ground in social action. Again, events like tonight can only be one piece in the broader picture of how to address questions of hate and racism. Our topic tonight, anti-Asian racism, is one of great urgency, as my colleagues have said already. We are right now seeing important modes of resistance and activism as a response to increases in the deplorable crimes that Dean Hackney has mentioned, crimes directed at Asian Americans, but also insults and things that aren't always regulated by criminal law, that in fact are part of the broader picture of racism. And activism on our campus and elsewhere is raising important questions about longer histories of racism and about the ideological formations that bolster racism. Such activism is also pushing us to double down on our commitments to inclusion at Northeastern and beyond. And I very much look forward to learning from the frameworks for analysis and also action that our speakers are going to discuss with all of us in the audience tonight. Thank you to everybody who's speaking tonight, and also thank you for everybody who is supporting this series. Without further ado, let me turn the microphone over to our moderator for this evening, Professor Serena Parekh, who directs the university's Politics, Philosophy, and Economics program. Over to you, Dr. Parekh.
Thank you very much, Dean Hackney, Dean Poyger, and Dean Jose. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone in the audience to the latest Civility Series panel on the topic of anti-Asian racism. We have 4 speakers with us today with a deep understanding of this topic, who will each speak for about 5 minutes before we take questions from the audience. But before I turn it over to the panelists, I'm going to take a moment to set the stage for our discussion and introduce a few concepts that will come up over the course of the next hour. Though anti-Asian racism is deeply embedded in US history, as we'll learn from our panelists shortly, it has bubbled to the surface recently for a number of reasons. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, violence against Asians in the US has increased dramatically. The group Stop AAPI Hate reported 3,800 incidents over the course of the last year. To give one example, a woman reported, quote, "I was in line at a pharmacy when a woman approached me and sprayed Lysol all over me. She was yelling, 'You're the infection, go home, we don't want you here.' I was in shock and cried as I left the building. No one came to help," end quote. Even in very diverse cities, Asians, including the elderly, have been verbally harassed, coughed at or spat on, pushed, punched, stabbed, or even killed. A 65-year-old Asian American woman was brutally beaten on her way to church. Many will also recall the horrific killing of 6 Asian women during a mass shooting in Atlanta only a few weeks ago. To bring this closer to home, a number of Asian students, staff, and faculty at Northeastern have also experienced verbal and physical harassment, including on our campus. In one incident, a person ran up to an Asian student on campus, pulled down their mask, and yelled slurs at the student, in the process potentially transmitting the COVID-19 virus. The kind of contempt for the humanity of the individual embodied in gestures like this, just because of the person's perceived racial origin, is deeply unsettling. Why does this continue to happen, and what can we do about it? What makes anti-Asian racism different from the anti-Black racism that came to the attention of the public in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, or the kind of anti-Latinx prejudice that is also all too present? How does racism intersect with misogyny to produce the kind of vulnerabilities that Asian women in particular have experienced? While we certainly won't be able to answer these questions definitively, our discussion today can hopefully contribute to a more deeply understanding anti-Asian racism and how we can respond effectively. Cynthia Choi, a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, has recently said that for a long time, her community has felt invisible and unseen. So we can begin with the question, why is anti-Asian racism often overlooked? In the view of some, it has something to do with the myth of the model minority. As Rachel Moo is going to talk about more in a minute, she's going to talk about this more in a minute, but I'd like to briefly introduce the concept. The myth of the model minority refers to a stereotype that depicts Asians as hardworking, intelligent, and financially successful, among other things. One reason the stereotype often goes unaddressed is because it seems positive. These are all admirable features. Yet the problem with it, as with many stereotypes, as with all stereotypes, are many. First, of course, is that it's untrue. Asian Americans are one of the most economically diverse ethnic groups, and the stereotype of the model minority erases the struggles and needs of poor and working class Asians. The model minority myth also makes the racism experienced by many Asians, including the dramatic and unsettling kinds noted above, seem less important and worthy of redress. It prevents us from having important and difficult conversations like the one we're going to have today. It's also important to keep in mind the ways racism and sexism are deeply intertwined in the experiences of some Asian American women, for whom racism often takes the form of sexual harassment that is overtly racist. The many racist stereotypes of East Asian women increases their vulnerability to certain kinds of sexualized violence. Given this, it will perhaps be less surprising that of the 3,800 incidents of violence against Asians mentioned earlier, as reported by Stop AAPI Hate, 2/3 were reported by women who often described being sexually harassed and COVID-19 as being weaponized as part of their sexual harassment. The phenomenon of anti-Asian racism in the 21st century is enormously complex, but this complexity needs to be understood so we don't reach for solutions that don't adequately address the problem. To further this goal of understanding, I turn now to our panelists to hear their insights on this ongoing challenge. So I'm going to turn the floor over now to Margaret Woo, who is a professor of law at our law school. Professor Woo?
Thank you so much. And I want to thank this civility series that is so needed, I think, in today's uncertain times. I just want to make really two points for my time. And one is that anti-Asian violence is pervasive and it's not new. And two, that two narratives undergird the anti-Asian racism that distinguishes it a little from other race hate. So first, according as Serena so nicely pointed out, according to AAPI this past year, there has been 38 reported incidents of anti-Asian hate, which apparently is 149% rise in hate incidents, right, against Asian Americans since the pandemic. But even then, what I want to stress is that this is underreported. Many incidents are not categorized appropriately, and there is a general reluctance to even report it or to document it, because somehow, if there's something wrong, then maybe something would have to be done. And more problematically, and these figures do not include the microaggressions that we as Asian Americans faces every day. The racial jokes, the slurs, the assumptions, and even downright hostile threats for us to go back to our home countries. And in fact, I don't know of a single Asian American who has not encountered these microaggressions. And I've asked around. I've asked my family, every single one of my Asian friends, my Asian colleagues, and everyone, and I mean everyone, has a story to share. So anti-Asian hate is pervasive and it is not new. Second, anti-Asian violence is different from other forms, a little bit different from other forms of racism, because it is propelled by two stereotypes, and they're conflicting and contrasting. One is the model minority and the other is the perpetual foreigner. So on the one hand, Asian Americans, as you heard earlier, can be the model minority. We're hardworking and quiet. But then on the other hand, depending on current geopolitical tensions, we're the alien, the perpetual foreigner, conveyors of dangerous diseases, importers of terrorism. So whatever happens over there will always affect what happens over here. because we are always viewed as the perpetual foreigner, even if we were born here, even if we've had generations in this country, including, building the railroad, working on farms and fields in California, Hawaii, serving in the military. And historically, it is the Asians, and most actually specifically the Chinese, who was the only ethnic group ever to be singled out by legislation for exclusion for immigration and citizenship under the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Japanese was the only ethnic group to be interned and taken away from their homes during World War II with the Japanese internment. And that's sanctioned by the US Supreme Court. So we are talking about blatant examples of systemic and legal racism. It was the Page Act of 1875 that for the first time prescribed the entry of a particular, prohibit the entry of a particular ethnic group on the premise that it endanger public order. And later, as I said, under the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigrants and even their American-born families were denied citizenship. And so taking it back to my own family, despite the fact that my great-grandfather was here and has been here since the 1880s, and my grandfather came since the 1920s, citizenship was denied to them until 1943 with the passage of the Magnuson Act. And we as a family were not able to join them until 64 when these immigration restrictions were finally lifted. So my family and I finally came and became naturalized citizens, but important to note, our citizenship is contingent in the sense that people always see us as being not fully American. In fact, I was researching at the Library of Congress once, and someone kindly wished me an enjoyable visit in America. And this was after I've become a citizen for many years. So relegated as a perpetual foreigner, not American, Asian Americans are misidentified and subject to anti-Asian aggression that's just lurking and waiting to be triggered by external events of what's happening over there. When a crisis occurs with an Asian nation, whether it's trade, pandemic, we're reminded again that in fact, we're really foreign. And this was true when Vincent Chin, a Chinese American in Detroit, was mistaken for a Japanese. He was attacked and killed during the Japanese-US trade war in 1982. This was also true when a Sikh temple was bombed shortly after 9/11. This was proven true again as China is now threatening to supersede the US as the world's #1 economic power. So what I ultimately conclude is that calling a stop to anti-Asian hate really will have a limited impact until we stop conflating what is happening over there with what is happening here, and that we must accept Asian Americans as Americans. So I'd like to turn it over to Professor Singh now.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Woo. Again, on the far outposts of the Western world rises the specter of the yellow peril and confronts the affrighted pale faces. This time, the chimera is not the saturnine, almond-eyed mask, the shaven head, the snaky pigtail of the multitudinous Chinese, nor the close-cropped bullet heads of the suave and smiling Japanese, but a face of finer features, rising, turbaned out of the Pacific, and bringing a new and anxious question to the dwellers on the so-called peaceful ocean. Nor is the apparition of a race different from that of the land it threatens, but of the same ancient Aryan stock. It is not indeed a question of the yellow and the white, but of the Oriental and the Occidental. it is nothing more nor less than a threatening inundation of Hindus over the Pacific coast. This excerpt is from a 1910 article that appeared in a magazine called The Forum, written by Herman George Schoeffer, who, according to his biography, was a well-known German-American architect, poet, writer, dramatist, journalist, a well-known intellectual. The tide of turbans that he's talking about, this is a reference to the Indian diaspora to the North American continent that had started about 20 years ago, mostly in the form of ex-policemen who had served in Shanghai, who had served the British colonial powers in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Singapore, and had started making their way to the Pacific Northwest, largely seeking better employment opportunities. 3 years before this article was published, there was an article published in the Puget Sound American that warned of a dusky peril. It was a full-page article, and it had the caricature of a Sikh with a turban, and somewhat amusingly, there was a snake charmer in the middle of that picture as well. So a play to stereotypes of the mysterious Orient. The article created such a frenzy that a few months later, a mob of white lumber mill workers in Bellingham, Washington, set upon the largely Sikh population of lumberjacks in Bellingham that numbered about 200 and ran them out of the city. There is a history to the racism that Indians have suffered in the US ever since the diaspora started. And because Sikhs made up about 80% of the earlier immigrants and were very distinguishable because of their unique appearance, this is something that the Sikh community has contended with for pretty much the past century. I'm going to read another short excerpt. This is from the Proceedings of the Asiatic Exclusion League, also April 1910. As a matter of fact, we, the people of the United States, are cousins far removed of the Hindus of the Northwest provinces. But our forefathers pressed to the West in the everlasting march of conquest, progress, and civilization. The forefathers of the Hindus went east and became enslaved, effeminate, caste-ridden, and degraded. Until today, we have the spectacle of the Western Aryan, the quote, lords of creation, if we may use the simile, while on the other hand, the East Aryans have become the slaves of creation, to carry the comparison to its logical conclusion. Now, we could dismiss these as the rantings of an organization that today we know to be overtly racist. But I give you this little nugget from the California State Board of Control, titled California and the Oriental, which says, the Hindu, in the opinion of the Commissioner of the State Bureau of Labor Statistics, is the most undesirable immigrant in the state. His lack of personal cleanliness, his low morals, and his blind adherence to theories and teachings, so entirely repugnant to American principles, makes him unfit for association with the American people. These are the roots of what we are facing today. And as Dr. Woo mentioned when she was speaking, a lot of these sentiments were codified into law. So the Immigration Act of 1917, and then after that, so the Immigration Act of 1917 created a barred zone which excluded immigration from several Eastern countries, including India, and subsequent changes made it virtually impossible for mostly the men who were here as immigrants to go back to their countries to marry. There were also miscegenation laws in place in states like California and Texas. So these men could neither marry here, nor could they go back to their home countries to bring their families back. The alien land laws, which were designed to preempt primarily Japanese ownership of land, also affected the Indian and the Sikh immigrants because they were mostly farmers. So neither could they pursue their livelihoods, nor could they have normal family lives. It took decades for this to change. A young Sikh immigrant, Bhagat Singh Thind, who arrived here in I think 1913 or so to go to school at the University of California at Berkeley, then served in the US Armed Forces in the World War, rose to rank of sergeant, got an honorable discharge, went on to get a PhD, was stripped of his citizenship. When a case to deny him his citizenship was taken to the Supreme Court, and Justice George Sutherland, who handed down the judgment, essentially said that Thind was not Caucasian in the, quote, common understanding, so he could not be included in the statutory category of white persons and was thus ineligible for citizenship. It took decades for this to be redressed. What does all of this mean? How is it relevant to us today? These very sentiments have informed the treatment that many immigrant groups, like the Asians specifically that we're talking about, and the Sikhs, have experienced in the US for decades after the laws were changed and some of these pernicious provisions were actually taken out. This came to the forefront in the aftermath of 9/11. I remember on the day of the attacks, one of my good friends who was traveling home to DC from Boston was arrested on a train in Providence. He was released a few hours later. For 3 days, Fox News and other outlets rolled footage of Sher Singh being led away in handcuffs with a photograph of Osama bin Laden sort of, in the same frame. This was despite the fact that he was let go the same evening because obviously he had no connection to the terrorist attacks. This continued until Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh, was shot dead in Arizona. You can draw a direct line between what was reported on television and the death in Arizona.
Mhm.
Lest we all go to a place of despair, I'm going to finish by telling you another story, which started in tragedy but had a very different ending. You might remember that several years ago, a gunman walked into a Gurdwara, a Sikh place of worship in Wisconsin, and opened fire, killing 6 people. We won't go into the reasons. We don't have the time to do that in detail today. But the important thing is that a Gurdwara was attacked and 6 people were killed. In the Boston area, and I know this happened all across the US, there was a tremendous outpouring of sympathy and support for the Sikhs. Why do I share this story? We need an antidote to the seeds of hatred and bigotry that were planted a century ago, seeds that have come to the forefront again through the demagoguery and hatred that we saw in the 4 years that Donald Trump was president. So this incident occurred. There was a huge outpouring of support, and at the Milford Gurdwara, which was the main Gurdwara in the Boston area, we had an interfaith service planned. So the Mass Council of Churches, several synagogues, Hindu organizations, various Christian denominations were all represented, and they were all going to speak at the Gurdwara in solidarity. I used to do some interfaith work with the Worcester Islamic Center. It was the holy month of Ramadan. And I called my contacts at the mosque and said, we have an interfaith event at the Gurdwara today. We would love for you to attend. And they were very supportive. They said, you know what? It's Ramadan. and your service is at 7 o'clock in the evening, that is exactly the time when we'll be breaking our fast. So we might not be able to make it. And I said, of course, that's absolutely understandable. Well, an hour before the service, I got a phone call from the Islamic Center, and they asked me, do you think you might be able to provide a few white sheets outside the Gurdwara? I said, yes, of course. That evening, as a Sikh service was in progress inside the Gurdwara, on the lawns, we had the grand spectacle of our Muslim brothers and sisters breaking their fast during the holy month of Ramadan outside the Gurdwara in solidarity with the Sikhs for what had happened. That's the spirit that we need today. I know it exists. Events like this one are evidence that it exists, but we don't have to look beyond our immediate vicinity. For every demagogue, for every cynic, for every bigot, there are hundreds of people who are appalled by what's happening and what we are talking about today. We just need to be able to connect with them. We need to tap into this reservoir of goodwill that I know exists. Only if we very visibly start embracing each other's pain can we break this cycle, which we've discussed has been going on for a century, but really is much, much longer than that. With that, I will turn it over to Professor Tai. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you very much. I am very grateful for the opportunity to join this very important and timely conversation. Like many of you, I've been appalled at the recent outburst of anti-Asian bigotry and anti-Asian violence. Like many people, this recent wave has affected me very deeply in different ways on different registers. Recent events have affected me personally as someone who is of Chinese descent and is clearly identifiable as Asian. So as if the pandemic were not enough, we can now add racism to the mix. But recent events have also affected me professionally. As a scholar of modern Chinese history and modern East Asian history, I have been asked repeatedly to draw on my expertise for some kind of comment, some kind of perspective to put recent events in their historical context. Asian American history is not my specialty, but I have been compelled professionally and also personally to revisit the history of Asian Americans. And this history is very rich and very critical for our understanding of this moment. Indeed, historians of Asian America have consistently demonstrated how Asian Americans occupy a critical but often invisible role in driving American history. For instance, discussions of race relations in the history of the United States often revolve around the binary of black and white. Now, as important as this binary is, it is also incomplete. Meanwhile, mainstream accounts of American history have often overlooked the pivotal role of Asian Americans or simply their presence. At the same time, the United States and American society have often sought to limit Asian immigration and deny Asian Americans equal protection under the law. These discriminatory efforts have had a profound legacy on the United States, and their effects have rippled beyond Asian Americans themselves. So for instance, laws prohibiting, limiting, or regulating Asian immigration essentially created the modern American immigration laws, immigration enforcement and policing system that we now know today. So the significance of Asian Americans rests not just on the fact that Asian Americans have been part of the American historical fabric, it also rests on the many ways that their experiences, their contributions, their struggles have shaped the United States. So whatever their actual origins or background, Asians in the United States have been viewed with deep suspicion and ambivalence. To paraphrase the historian Erica Lee, Asian Americans have been viewed as perpetual foreigners at worst, probationary Americans at best. This fear, this continual othering of Asians in the United States, as many of you already know, and as my other panelists have already noted, has had a very, very long history. And this latent anti-Asian bigotry have often erupted onto the surface, especially during moments of change, during moments of crises. During the 19th century, for instance, the Chinese were faced with calls for the Chinese must go and all sorts of vicious violence. The Japanese Americans, for instance, during the Second World War were interned and stripped of their rights as citizens. In the aftermath of 9/11, many South and Southeast Asian Americans became targets of anti-Muslim bigotry and violence. So, unfortunately, the recent upsurge of anti-Asian violence and bigotry is nothing new. The other week, when an elderly Filipina was savagely beaten in New York on her way to church, she was met with declarations from her attacker: "You don't belong here, you don't belong here." This attack and its many, many variations, of course, draw on this wellspring, draw on this long history of anti-Asian bigotry that was always just beneath the surface, ready to be activated. So what to do? Well, combating anti-Asian violence and bigotry will require a panoply of efforts: changes in laws, in policies, geopolitics, in education, and in community organization. There is no one neat solution. And because anti-Asian violence and bigotry have had such a long history, any of these efforts must be advanced over the long term. I am sure that my fellow panelists and I can discuss such efforts, but one of the most important things that universities like Northeastern can do, of course, is to educate. The long history of anti-Asian violence and bigotry that I have recounted and my fellow panelists have recounted only touches the surface of this much longer history. And this history, again, has often been overlooked, ignored, or even dismissed. Many scholars of Asian American history report how their work can sometimes feel like Groundhog Day, where they teach class after class after class the history of Asian America for the first time, educating students on this long history for the first time. Because unfortunately, this history is still marginalized and still excluded from the broader history of the United States. So I am going to end my remarks with a photo. If someone could please pull up the photo. So many of you are probably familiar with this iconic photo taken on May 10th, 1869. It is a photo celebrating the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory Summit, Utah. So for decades up to that point, the United States steadily moved westward, encouraging settlement, waging wars, expropriating Native American land. Now, the completion of the railroad was critical to America's history. It revolutionized transport, it united two halves of the country, and it laid the foundations for America's rise as a global power. But of course, completely absent in the photo are the Chinese railroad workers, more than 15,000 of them, who were brought from China and made up 90%. They made up 90% of the workforce on the western part of the railroad, so they are not insignificant. Now, whatever you may think of the significance or the importance of this moment, I do think this photo is symbolic of the position of Asian Americans in American history, how their experiences and even their presence are often excluded or ignored despite their centrality to that very history. I do think it is time for universities and other institutions to stop perpetuating this omission by recognizing that the study of Asian America is an essential part of any American education. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to invite my fellow panelists, Rachel Woo, Director of the Asian American Center, to continue the conversation.
Good evening. Wanted to talk a little bit about the model minority myth. I've been thinking a lot more recently about even just the phrase model minority myth and how the word myth is in it, and yet it seems to be a reality and accepted by so many people when we don't accept many other myths in the world. You think of storytelling or myths with children, children's stories, these idea of myths that we know aren't true, and yet the model minority myth seems to be one that still holds true today. just to re-clarify some things that were already said, the model minority myth is sort of this persistent stereotype that paints Asian Americans as inherently successful and problem-free. And I would say particularly in contrast to other minority groups. However, Asian Americans of lower socioeconomic status don't fill the model minority myth and are more likely to work in low-wage industries such as restaurants, salons, housekeeping, and factories, which can make them more vulnerable. I've been reading a lot, and experts believe the model minority myth has hidden anti-Asian racism for far too long, which I would agree with, and I believe my fellow panelists would as well. By painting millions of Asian Americans with a broad brush of universal success, both academics and activists say damage is done to all members of the community, most notably Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders, and those whose struggles with economic realities are often rendered invisible. Asian American families, educators, and community leaders say they have long battled a misconception that all Asian American students are high achieving and do not require as much attention as others. Asian American parents say that when they tell school officials that their children are struggling with mental health issues, learning disabilities, or language barriers, their concerns are not taken seriously, and consequently, their children don't get the help that they need. Another scary statistic is that according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, suicide is the leading cause of death among Asian Americans between the ages of 20 and 24, which is primarily when a lot of people are in university or college studying and trying to fulfill this idea of perfectionism and filling out this idea of the model minority myth. So I've been thinking a lot about Beverly Tatum's psychoanalysis that she did in 1997, and there's a great quote. It says, in terms of intergroup relations, the myth of the model minority has served to pit Asian Americans against other groups targeted by racism. The accusing message of the dominant society to Blacks, Latinx, and Native Americans is, they overcame discrimination, why can't you? This, of course, is a damaging message for anybody who hears it. Asians have been described by sociologists as a racial wedge used to depict non-white groups as having cultural flaws that have led to their societal ills. Indeed, the model minority myth, while addressed more explicitly in recent movements, still has yet to be interrogated as in its more insidious manifestations. I believe a call to help deconstruct the model minority myth is to build alliances with other racial groups, not at the expense or cost of any particular group, but to build a bridge and create a collaboration between them. There's a history between Black and Asian activists that remind their followers that liberation is a shared project against white supremacy, and that institutions, for example, the prison system, can enforce white supremacy, and they should not serve to alleviate the struggles of one community over another. Instead, that we should come together. Some examples of this are Grace Lee Boggs and her husband, James Boggs, work side by side to help fight for civil rights for all people. Yuri Kochiyama befriended Malcolm X, and they wrote a lot of letters back and forth to each other, and she was actually present when he was shot and killed. There are a lot of examples of history of how we can also come together and collaborate. And I hope that with the great advice and thoughts of everyone on this panel, that people will take action and figure out what the next steps look like.
So thank you so much to all our panelists for those really insightful comments and questions that were raised, and the historical context that you put these questions into. We're now going to take questions from our audience. And so I see some questions coming in, which is terrific. But I'm going to get the conversation started with a question. And the question is this: one of the themes that's come up in everyone's comments so far is how deep anti-Asian racism is in US history, politics, and laws. I might even add culture and society. In your view, why do you think anti-Asian violence isn't as prominent in political discourse and in media as other kinds of racism, despite the fact that it's so deeply entrenched in so many ways? And I'm going to ask Professor Woo if she'd like to get us started, and then whoever would like to jump in after, please feel free.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And you know, for one, of course, the anti-Asian violence is certainly led by the narrative of the model minority myth. So the model minority myth end up erasing and hiding many of the history of racism against Asians in America. But I think the other reason may be that, you know, Asian Americans has really great diversity. And oftentimes when race incidents happen, they tend to target particular ethnic groups. And in that way, it's really made it difficult actually for different Asian groups to rally around the identity of Asian America. And what I think is actually interesting is that within the recent years, the misidentification of Asians, that is the Japanese Chinese mistaken for Japanese, tend to actually help eliminate some of the prior differences within different Asian groups, and have added to the Asian American identity and movement. So I'm actually anticipating a greater attention and greater movement in Asian America. I think you're muted, Serena. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much for that, Professor Woo. Would anyone else like to answer?
I'd like to offer a perspective, albeit a somewhat narrow one, from in the Sikh context. I think for the Sikhs in particular, one of the biggest issues is a general lack of awareness about who the Sikhs even are. And, this manifests itself in, interesting ways. Specifically after 9/11, the reason why Sikhs were targeted is because they were mistaken for Muslims.
Yeah.
Because those were the images that you saw on television. So the assumption was these are Muslims and they need to be targeted. Now, of course, when we were responding to the attacks of 9/11, we made sure that our response didn't say, hey, don't attack us, we're not Muslims. It was really to talk about why this was wrong,
Yeah.
and why nobody should be targeted. And, very much to the point that Dr. Woo made, I think this is exactly what we need to do. If uninhibitedly we embrace the pain of whoever is being attacked, regardless of who we are and who they are, it's not going to matter. And probably that's the only thing which is going to remedy this, because all of our little silos don't have critical mass. But if we put them all together, we most certainly do.
Yeah.
I also think that anti-Asian racism is directly linked to history and how members of the AAPI community are often depicted in US history lessons are as foreigners or national security threats, as opposed to people who have lived and worked in America and have challenged it to live up to its ideals of equality for all. I think that, for example, 5th grade students are expected to know how to list Japanese aggression in Asia and the Pearl Harbor attacks, but not the incarceration of Japanese Americans in the US. And they don't learn this because educators think either it's not important enough or it just puts the US in a bad light. So it's better to talk about other countries and their wrongdoings than it is our own, and be reflective of our own past mistakes. So I think K through 12 specifically, if we're talking about education and starting this education at an earlier age, American history texts reinforce the narrative that Asian immigrants and refugees are fortunate to have been helped and been saved by the US. The story does not begin with US imperialist wars that were waged to take Asian wealth and resources and the resulting violence and displacement in relation to Asian lives. So a lot of people don't realize that an Asian diaspora is here in the US because the US went to Asia first.
I would like to add, if it's okay, I'd like to add to two emerging trends in the current conversation. So one, I do support Sarbpreet's call to push against what scholars have called disidentification, basically saying, I'm not X, I'm Y, therefore, don't attack me. And there is actually a lot of history of that within Asian American communities, unfortunately. So for instance, Chinese and Japanese Americans were equally targeted in the United States during the early 20th century, placed in the category of Mongols, quote unquote. But then during the Second World War, as the United States went to war against Japan, many Chinese Americans wore these buttons saying, I'm not Japanese, I'm Chinese. At the time, of course, China was the ally of the United States. But then when the Cold War began to heat up, the relative positions of Chinese and Japanese switched completely. Japan was now drafted as an American ally in the Cold War. China was now this new red menace. Many Chinese Americans came under deep suspicion. Many Chinese American scientists, for instance, were run out due to the Red Scare. So historically, this kind of disidentification does not, of course, yield to any sort of overall justice in the long run. I also want to go back to what Rachel mentioned, which is that I think that a complete history of Asian America is not just highlighting or spotlighting experiences, but as Rachel suggested, also highlighting connections. Because as she mentioned, many immigrants, Asian American immigrants, are in the United States because of the actions of the United States, the various other European imperialist powers, and also American policies. I mean, why were, for instance, why were Chinese railroad workers in the United States to begin with? Obviously, businessmen like Leland Stanford needed cheap, reliable labor, but also because, and I was just doing the research on this, it's because the United States negotiated a diplomatic treaty to ensure that Chinese migrants who were once barred from leaving China were now given this unalienable right to go wherever they wanted. So whenever the United States needed labor, they were encouraged to go. They were encouraged to go to the United States, but when they reached a critical mass, they were unwelcome and so forth. So I think that kind of education is required to sort of trace the entire circle of anti-Asian bigotry and violence.
I really appreciate all those comments. As some of you know, my own work is on refugees. And just to go back to what Rachel said, refugees are often portrayed as being people who should be grateful for being taken into the US, and they often are, and there's a lot to that. But it's often hard for people to think of the reason why, say, Hmong refugees were resettled in large numbers because of their connection to the Vietnam War and the way that they supported US actions overseas. So this larger history that that Philip and Rachel spoke of is really, really important in understanding the topic today. Let me pose a slightly different question that comes from the audience. And this, I think, gets at some of the issues that we're all thinking about. Who gets to say what it means to be American? Like, who determines this? And why is it so hard to change? So the person who asked the question speculates, is it patriarchy? Is it fragility? Is it fear of losing power? What sustains what some people will call the white supremacy that gives rise to these acts of anti-Asian violence? I don't know if any of you have immediate thoughts on this and would like to jump in.
I do, but I want to give somebody
Please
else a
go
shot.
ahead.
No, please. Yeah, go ahead.
So unlike my distinguished colleagues on the panel, I'm not an academic, I'm a storyteller. So I'll come at it from a different perspective. I think it's the myths that we have created. They cast a huge shadow. Think about the word pioneer. What does it connote? You know, to most Americans, when you use the word pioneer, it'll probably conjure up images of a white family traveling west in a covered wagon. Yet, if we go searching, we find stories of many different kinds of pioneers. You know, for some work that I'm doing right now, I was researching agriculture in California. A lot of the innovations were brought by Chinese and Japanese workers who toiled in the fields of California in the early 1900s. You know, there's the story of a penniless Sikh immigrant who came to the US in 1906, failed at lettuce farming in Imperial Valley 3 times, then went to Arizona, and somebody palmed off a piece of horrible land with alkaline soil to him. And this man hitched his mules and started plowing, and everybody laughed at him. And they said, look at that stupid Hindu. He's plowing that horrible land when there's so much land around. Well, guess what? His name is in Arizona's history books today as the founder of deep tillage. His name was Diwan Singh. Was he any less an American pioneer? Well, my question is rhetorical, of course. I think the myths need to be reclaimed in a certain sense. The narrative has to be reclaimed, and all of these stories need to come out so that everybody can understand that it was just not that family going west in a wagon.
Mhm. That's true. So yeah, I would totally agree with that. And that question, you can come at answering that question from a economic perspective or political perspective, but I tend to take a more cultural perspective. So who decides what it is to be American? Yes, we need to reclaim the myth. And in the United States today, the myth oftentimes is determined by the media. And I could remember when I was growing up, in the media, the only Asian images that I was, you know, that I was exposed to was a Zulu from Star Trek, who's an alien, or there was a Chinese worker in Bonanza, who is yet again an immigrant. And those were the only images. And so those images define for all of us as we're growing up what, you know, what American is. It's gonna be Leave It to Beaver rather, or Brady Bunch, or whatever generation you grew up with, rather than Asian Americans. And I think that we're seeing a change now, though, as the arts and the media, as we're pushing forth to make sure that those myths get reclaimed and we see more Asian faces around us. I think that will help change the kind of misperceptions that has underlied throughout history.
Rachel or Philip? So we're actually at 6:30. So I'm going to ask one last question to leave us to take what we can take away from this. And my question is this: how do we confront anti-Asian racism while still confronting other kinds of racism? Building on what Sarbpreet's saying, this kind of anti-racist solidarity, what can we do in order to encourage it, to develop it, to further it in general, and in particular in our academic community? One member of the audience wrote to add on to this: how can students show up for Asian people in general, and in particular in a semester like this where we're all remote? So if you have any thoughts in general on this, or any concrete solutions that our audience members could take away, we would love to hear it.
I'll just go ahead and just offer my own thoughts. I think that any kind of solidarity against anti-Asian violence must come at different levels. I suppose we could do this individually by showing up, by making sure that we call out injustice where we saw it, because injustice for one is injustice for all. We discussed also this last week in another session about the importance of bystander training, the idea that we must be mentally prepared to intervene. Of course, we want to intervene safely, but we want to also intervene effectively. Just the fact that we can find ways to break that inertia of an action, I think is a great start. Any one of those incidents that we've seen recently, if only someone did something, made a phone call, stood next to the person, or just screamed stop, maybe some of these violent attack may not have been as serious as they were. But I also want to remind people not to individualize the problem and shift the onus of combating this really big issue onto the shoulders of ordinary people, individuals. Individuals can only do so much. So I hope that some kind of a prescription is done at a policy level or institutional level. And I've talked about this various ways that we can go about this. But yeah, so I think we have to address this at different registers.
I definitely believe that the broader conversation has to involve other groups and movements that we have to sort of get, my personal beliefs, if you have to get away from this siloed liberation and the idea of co-liberation, that my liberation is wrapped up in everybody else's. And so until we're all free, no one's free kind of concept. I believe that there's very much a connected history between groups that are fighting for equality and justice. And I think if we can intentionally put those groups together, that's where a lot of power lies that can be used for good. I think we have to think about how all kinds of violence, racist violence especially, affects not just one community, but it does affect all communities. Asians, Blacks, Indigenous, Latinx, and other vulnerable communities are all affected. And I think solidarity actually remains a rich tradition in history in all of these communities, if we can remember that. And as Philip just said, to take action, to take a small step. If every individual took a small step towards creating change, it would actually have a big impact.
Yeah, and I just want to second and third that actually. And for those people who are interested in doing that small action in terms of getting bystander training, which actually has been shown to be very effective. There's a very good organization called Hollaback. In fact, I just finished one today, and it's an hour long, and it's geared towards particular scenarios, and it teaches all of us to help break the kind of cycle of attacks and do it in a safe way. And I also agree that in addition to individual action, to address particular instances, we really need to continue to think about addressing the issue systematically. And that really is systemically. And that really is the best way of building coalition, right? So rather than reacting to particular instances, we keep on reminding ourselves that in fact, there's a systemic and institutional problem here. And again, you can work on it on an individual level by calling your legislature to change legislation, or you could create committees to make and lobby for institutional change. But once you start thinking about this as an institutional and systemic issue, I think the coalitions will become clearer.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll just end with my own thoughts on this. I think the first step to tackling these deep systemic problems is understanding. So I appreciate everyone in the audience who came out today to listen and to understand and to think with us. We have absolutely not been able to tackle every aspect of the problem or get into the weeds of the nuances. And there's some great questions that I wasn't able to ask. The relationship between xenophobia in general and anti-Asian violence in particular, the ways in which the sexualization, the hypersexualization of Asian women impact the ways we address anti-Asian racism. Such important questions, but unfortunately we don't have time to address these all. But I hope you'll join me with taking away from this panel a commitment to continue thinking about these issues and continuing conversations with each other in your classes, with your peers, with your professors, with whoever you can talk to about these, these incredibly important issues. And with that, I'd like to extend my sincerest thanks to our panelists for their comments and insights today, and again to the audience for taking the time to be with us and participating via the Q&A. The recording of this event will be available at the CSSH YouTube channel and Facebook page, and links will be available in the chat. So thank you once again, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.